Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we are going to talk about behavior, managing behaviors, and parenting behaviors. And my guest today is Dr. Andrew Kahn. Dr. Kahn is the Associate Director of Behavior Change and Expertise at Understood. He is a licensed psychologist who focuses on ADHD, learning differences, anxiety, autism spectrum disorder, behavior, executive function, and emotional regulation. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Kahn joining us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Kahn, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. It's good to see you.
We have been in the same ecosystem at Understood for a while, and it is such an honor to have you here. I can't believe I haven't had you here before.
Well, thanks for having me.
One of the reasons why I wanted to have you here is because on your podcast, you talk a lot about behavior, and that is something that comes up frequently for parents in our community. You specialize in behavior change, particularly with children who have ADHD and learning differences. So I'd love to kind of start with understanding or maybe explaining how understanding a child's behavior can lead to more positive outcomes for parents and children, because oftentimes parents are very frustrated because they see the behaviors, but they don't understand them.
Yeah, I think for so many families, and particularly even before your kids are perhaps diagnosed, is that behavior is communication. So when our kids are behaving in a certain way, and honestly, most often in the way that we don't care for, or in a way that embarrasses us or leaves us looking in a bad light, it is something that causes so much distress and anxiety with us as parents that I think that sometimes it's hard to even take the moment to say, what's really happening here? What's going on? And I think that, we make so many assumptions around, as adults, it's very easy to forget what it was like to be a kid in terms of when you didn't have the language to communicate yet, or you weren't able to take your internal sensations or emotions and thoughts and feelings and say, when you did that, I really didn't like that. Instead, what we see is something thrown, someone hit, something smashed, some stomping feet. And those things get our attention in a very different way. And the key word here is attention, right? So I say this all the time on my podcast, but it's because I say it in life. The most reinforcing thing we give our kids is our attention. And when they misbehave or do something that is really out of the realm of what we'd like to see, it's really easy to get our attention and we get trapped. And I think a lot of this is about helping parents not get trapped, how to communicate with your child better, understanding that behavior is communication, and really thinking about how do we become sort of detectives or scientists in that process. And that's so much of what we focus on.
Absolutely. And when we talk about kind of interpreting that behavior, and you talk about behavior being communication, when I think about the little kiddos who don't even have the language development yet to really truly express how they're thinking and feeling, and all they can do is throw that shoe because they can't formulate the thoughts and put them together to express what they're experiencing.
Yeah. And the other part of that, I think that we really have to keep in mind is that there are a couple of little illusions when we deal with our kids. So, if you think about a kid with a learning and thinking difference like ADHD, it has nothing to do with their IQ. In fact, kids with ADHD have average or better IQs like all kids. The problem is with kids who have neurodevelopmental differences is sometimes they function in social and communication ways at a lower age than what they are chronologically. So your 6-year-old, when they're upset, acts like a 4-year-old. And they can also talk to you in the car on the ride home like a 9-year-old because they maybe have some other skills. But when we're upset, we tend to lose some of those skills, and neurodevelopmental disorders result in some of those delays. And that little disconnect is enough to really trip up a lot of us as parents. particularly because our emotions are tied. And when I say be a scientist or be a detective, good scientists and detectives are good because they try to keep their emotions out of their investigations. And as parents, that almost feels impossible.
And it can feel very impossible, particularly when you're in the moment, which I think is why so many parents will say they feel like they are reacting and not going into that investigator mode because, again, they're responding to what it is that they see. And given that kids with ADHD and learning differences process information differently than their neurotypical peers, it seems that unclear expectations from parents can, or even educators or other adults in their lives, can also play a role in how the behavior manifests.
Oh, that's so, so true. The idea, one of the phrases that I've sort of stolen from Michelle Garcia Winner is this idea of the unexpected. If something that is unexpected occurs for any of us, we have a somewhat confused reaction. We're off our game. We don't know what to do. And for kids with neurological differences, kids with ADHD, there are a lot of things that can surprise them because, as you said, without knowing the expectations in advance, they might have outsized reactions or the inability to sort of navigate when something changes in an unexpected way. And remember, unexpected for them may not be unexpected for us as grown-ups, but for them, it certainly is. And that's something that is really important to navigate.
Yeah. And it also seems that in children, again, with these learning and thinking differences, stress and struggles with self-regulation can contribute to some of the challenging behaviors that parents see, that educators see in the classroom, particularly when we think about students with ADHD, where self-regulation is pretty prominent.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I think self-regulation can be such a primary barrier to being able to think and problem solve. And I think that another parent trap is the idea that we say, well, let's be proactive. Okay, let's stop this behavior before it occurs. And most parents say, well, I love that idea, but I've already had so many things go wrong that, let's be honest, a lot of what we do are reactive strategies. We've seen something go wrong before. Can we plan for it the next time? And as parents, I always say, the one skill that I want a parent to have as they're learning to navigate their child's differences, and one of the most important, is to give themselves grace. When they make the mistakes, when they realize, I'm not successful today, and I need to get up and have a growth mindset and say, tomorrow, I'm going to do this better. And if I don't, I'm going to try to do things like maybe regulate my own emotions, because there's more than one of us involved in this interaction. And parents have to learn a lot of the same things we teach the kids. And sometimes that's a gap where parents are like, I need my kid to change. I'm like, we do too. But you are dance partners. And if you're pushing and dancing in one direction, pushing really hard, sometimes it's hard for that kid not to fall over or to feel overpowered. And there's something to be said for how we make the interaction work.
Right. And that's when that co-regulation piece is so important. You talked about, stepping away and giving yourself some grace. But then again, that co-regulation, regulating your own emotions, will actually help your child regulate their own emotions as well.
Exactly. It's both what you bring to the situation in terms of if you're calm, but also what you model. If you show that your emotions are starting to pick up and you decide to say outwardly, you know what? My brain isn't where I need it to be. I'm going to step away for 3 minutes and regulate myself, or do a breath, or model something and come back. And the key is come back, because believe it or not, I'd love to escape from conflict too. It would be great because I can make it go away, but it will not improve if I don't address it. So I think that there's really high value in modeling that in our co-regulation.
Right. Modeling it and then explaining what it is that you did. Like you gave the example, I'm going to go, and step out and take a breath, because, if parents just walk away, kids don't know and they'll make assumptions. Oh, he's mad. She's mad. I don't know what happened. And if you instead explain what it is that you're doing, that's kind of the modeling that you're talking about.
Exactly. And that modeling is really that what we teach our children when their eyes fall on what we do. And we are their first teachers, and we are their first example of how relationships work. And I think it's a serious responsibility. And sometimes how often do you get to parent with all of your energies intact and all of your emotions in check? I mean, we had a day, we had work, or or our daily activities or other responsibilities. And we bring those with us. And so, all this theoretical stuff is all fine and good, but give ourselves credit for the fact this is hard. Parenting is probably one of the hardest jobs you're ever going to have, and the best, because you're doing it with someone you love, and you can't always say that at work. Some of us can, but we're not all are that lucky. So yeah,
Right. And it is a hard job. It's a hard job, but it's a rewarding job. And you don't have an instruction manual. I often say, you never leave that hospital or wherever, with an instructional manual. You have to figure it out as you go along. And that can be really challenging. And when you're raising kids with thinking and learning differences, you need a different rule book.
Definitely. And you have to be willing to throw away the rule book at times to figure out, is there a different lesson for my individual kid? Because there's only one of your kid, and it's their uniqueness is part of what makes them so awesome. And sometimes what makes them so infuriating.
Right. On your podcast, you talk about the role of parenting behavior. We've been talking about, a child's behavior, and oftentimes that's what parents are paying attention to. And that usually is what brings them into my office or into the offices of other clinicians because they're concerned about their child's behavior. But you talk about the role of parenting behavior in influencing a child's actions. I'd love for you to kind of talk about that. Are there specific behaviors that parents can model? You've talked a little bit about that already to encourage, better self-regulation and responses in their children.
Yeah, I think so much of what we do as parents is what we bring to our children. So, for example, one of the things that I talk about at times is that, and you mentioned this before, that we have no instruction manual. And I always sort of giggle. I watched the old movie Raising Arizona, and he walks out with a baby and he grabs Dr. Spock's old 1960s book on parenting. He goes, "Oh, I brought the instructions." And it was just total laugh out loud moment where you're like, yeah, that doesn't exist. This is not it. The instruction manual we actually have burned into us is what we observed our parents do when we were kids. And for better or for worse, we come from different generations and models and ideas. And I think for a lot of parents, I ask them to reflect on what do they know about parenting when they come to see me? What is it did you know about what you saw? What are the things about your own parents' parenting that you don't want to reenact in your own patterns? And then I ask them sort of sheepishly, which of those things have you reenacted that you're not happy about? And then we laugh together because it's like, oh, this is such a human trap because it's
absolutely,
we all go to the school of our own raising, and we don't get to choose it. We don't get to tuition into some other school or get a scholarship to the better school of parenting. Not assuming our parents were bad at it, but it's just different. So I think for some parents, it's about building that self-awareness that what you bring to the situation first and foremost comes from self-regulation. And then building a little bit more of an image of your child that is most accurate to helping them. So let me decode that for a second. If you have a child with ADHD, for example, it's incredibly important for parents to know what that means about their child. If you don't know where your child's differences are grounded, the fact that their neurology and wiring is different, or that there are certain things that they're going to refuse to do, or because they can't, or because it's really hard and they don't have confidence. And teaching you as a parent to understand that data so that you can have a more systematic approach to your child is what makes all the difference. Not all parents are lucky enough to be intuitives as parents, meaning I just get it. I get it, I do it, and it works. For the handful of you who that works for, they're probably not listening to us. They're probably just living their lives, right? But parenting is not intuitive, and giving yourself permission to know that's not what happens. And to be parenting is something that makes you doubly vulnerable. So I'll explain. When my child first came into my life, I realized for the first time my heart is now living outside of my chest. It is now tied to this other living entity that I will want to protect with all of my animal and loving energy. Simultaneously, it also means that my ability to feel under control of things is also a little bit less inside of me. And I think that really acknowledging that this is a process that requires us to be more self-aware, to be vulnerable, and to find people and information we trust. So, you and I are sort of spoiled. We both work together on vetting information that is evidence-based every day of our working lives. Most of my parents don't know where that exists. So sending them to websites like going to you and seeing you, or going to Understood's website to get information. These are things that most parents aren't blessed with, and we have the ability to share with them so they can self-educate and feel confident in what they're reading, as opposed to wondering if that influencer on TikTok really has it all factual,
Absolutely. And I think that is another trap for parents, right? They can get into that TikTok world or that Facebook parent group and get all this information that's not vetted, right? And the thing about parenting, you talk about, I love the way that you described it, and it's dynamic, and in the sense that it can change from day to day. The parenting behavior that you exhibited and the strategies that you used and worked beautifully on Monday can absolutely fall apart on Friday.
Yes. Oh, that's so true. Yeah, and that brings up a great point, which is as parents, we like to think we have a bag of tricks. And one of the easiest parent fails is, as you said, your Monday skill doesn't work today on Thursday. And then instead of putting it back in the bag for later, you think you need to throw it away. And then so when you come back to another conflict, another challenge a week later, your bag's getting emptier, not fuller. And that's an illusion, because something that may have worked in the past, if you give it a rest, may work again in the future. It is about the delivery. If you bring confidence and calmness to how you attempt your strategies, and when something doesn't work, can you smile and shrug? Can you take a breath and step away and go, all right, today it didn't work. We're gonna go back to the bag and see what else is in there. And I think that for so many parents, they feel like because their children are flexible in dealing with the problems that they have, that we run out of strategies, and when in actuality, we keep accumulating. And we just have to remind ourselves, what's in that bag? What can we try again? Could I try it slightly differently with the same skill? And if you're lucky enough to co-parent and have a partner, can you reality test and say, hey, what about that worked or didn't work? Can you honestly tell me something, because I need to hear it? And that's, for some of us, that we're lucky and when we have that, but not everybody does.
Right. And that's where we can go in that investigator mode that you talked about earlier, because it may have worked beautifully on Monday because your child was in a great calm space. But then on Friday, they had an argument with their best friend and they're no longer speaking. And then you come in with that strategy, but the circumstances and the context has completely changed,
right,
and it falls flat.
Exactly. And, I think the other part, I want to circle back to something we were talking about with TikTok and Facebook groups. Facebook groups, TikTok, the one thing that I love about their existence is that it allows people to have a sense of community. And if you think about community and family and any group that we belong to, if you have a realistic view of that group, that it's made up of both kind, caring, and sometimes misinformed people, and just take that approach into those groups, I think there's lots to be gained from feeling I'm not alone, or I have other people who suffer like I do, or I can experience their joy in trying something that works and go, okay, this can happen. And I think those are really high value sort of interactions, as long as when you make your important decisions, you have to ask yourself, where's my data? Is it really expert driven? Is it based on the evidence? And if it isn't, where can I go and find that out? And there are more and more places where that exists today. And I think that's something that we need to plug them into. I love things like, you and I have done some work and we've created a chatbot, for example, at Understood. And the chatbot, for example, if you were to ask a parenting question of the chatbot, it's only going to grab information from our 4,500 articles and podcasts. It's not going to go and create an illusion response from, ChatGPT. And I think that when you have something like that 24 hours a day for free, that it's just great to know that you can go somewhere where they've limited how the information is gathered to a safe array of info. And I actually struggled at times when I would leave a therapy session saying, what if they have a question at night? And I've been doing this 25 years, Karen. It's a long thing. But a lot of us take our clients with us and their experiences. And when I know that there's places they can go when I'm not there, I actually sleep better knowing that that stuff is being created, that I can send them to your podcast, that I can, send them, your referral information or to our websites. That kind of resourcing is such a source of calmness and reassurance for me. So I think that's a cool part of this.
Right. And it absolutely is a gift to give parents, because especially in those moments of heightened stress where you don't know what to do, you are at your wit's end, you want some resources. And again, when you know that there are organizations like Understood that vet the information for you, you just have, like you're saying, you can sleep better. They can sleep better knowing that you have the right information at your fingertips to at least get started on addressing some of the struggles that you're facing and better understanding, the difficulties that your child might be experiencing. And that is just so important. And it's particularly important for, communities where, they don't have access to a lot of resources. And the fact that Understood provides these resources for free is so valuable, because that inequity means that not everyone might be able to get into to see a therapist or, an educational specialist, but they can get this information that they can, and then they can utilize the tools in their own lives with their kids.
Oh, it's so important. And I think that, knowing where you're getting your information and whether or not the provider or the creator has an equity lens, and thinking about those pieces. I spent the better part of 20 years in schools that were, these were Title I schools, meaning we had kids with significant needs, 98% or higher free and reduced lunch populations, meaning my kids weren't going out with money in their pockets to be able to go and pay even a copay to go see a clinician. So we knew we had to find information that was accessible to them, regardless of the speed of their internet, or if they had to go to the library or go to the community center to get access to Wi-Fi, even in the pre-COVID days. So I think that that's always such an important piece, is that, sure, if you run a business, you want to have scale because scale means more money. But in our business, I can only see one client in a room at a time. And I've taught the same skill 1,000 times. So today, when we have formats like ours, where we can do this on a podcast or put something on a website where it can reach thousands of people for free, it's such an important mission to have, to be able to say, one of the favorite things I hear from clients is something was going wrong with my kid, and then I heard your voice in my head. And, it's not that it was my voice, it's what I said. And when they echo that, I'm like, oh, this thing has left me and belongs to someone else. And that is the ultimate a sign of like, this is going well. People are absorbing and integrating things that are helpful to them and their families. And it's the most rewarding part of the work.
It really is, because you get an opportunity to answer questions that parents have, and they have them in the moment. And I think that when you have ADHD and other learning differences, it can be difficult for children to meet traditional expectations. And so parents are confused by that. And I think one of the questions that comes up for a lot of parents I work with is, how do you balance between holding your kids accountable while supporting their unique needs? Does that come up for you as well?
Every single day of my working life. Yes. Yeah. And I can answer that pretty directly. I mean, I think, you get into the situation of evaluating behavior, and you have to always ask yourself, was my child capable of meeting my demand in that moment? So the thing I was asking them to do, given the circumstances, their development, what they've done in the past, was it realistic to expect them to do the behavior I expected, or more likely the behavior that I hoped for? And in a lot of those situations, you have to maybe step away and say, okay, if it wasn't realistic, how much should I really consequence that child? And sometimes the best consequence for that child is to go back and teach them again how to do the thing that you expect them to do, and support them through that learning, and do that learning and modeling with them in lower stakes situations, meaning when there's less stress, when there's less stuff going on. Because any skill learned is only going to be something they can show you that they can do if the circumstances around you are okay. Like, I'm calm enough, I'm not in crisis, I'm not melting down. But the more I practice it successfully, even in calm situations, the more likely it's going to come to me automatically. And that's a process of time, repetition, and delivering that information in a calm way. And for some parents, my favorite way to really navigate some of the consequence questions, that's a tongue twister, is talking about sometimes life gives you natural consequences. So if your child speaks out of turn in a social situation and kids turn away, or they are not able to engage in an activity because really their behavior was highly out of the expected realm for that behavior, I don't need to go home and double consequence them. I can have them come home and say, "How did that feel? Like, let's talk about that." I would think that would make me upset or make you sad. How were you? And if they can acknowledge that they felt sad or that they had some sort of, emotion about, yeah, I didn't like how that worked, they've already received the consequence. So we just have to remind them and connect it to, next time, here are some things we can do. You want to learn that? You want to talk about it in a little bit? And we can help them navigate around the natural consequence, which is always the most powerful. Yeah. And the one thing I want to say about natural consequences that's really hard is as a parent, if you know your child is destined to have a failure moment and it's going to be painful, a good parent, when they know their child isn't going to be physically hurt or dramatically injured emotionally, sometimes has to let their child fail. You have to let them sort of skin their emotional knees, so to speak, and without saying, "I told you so," and saying, "Oh, I feel for you, kiddo. What can we do differently?" Because there's no better learning than that moment. But as parents, we don't have the tolerance for our own child's distress. And that's something you've got to really look at as a parent. If you can't tolerate your kid being in distress, then you will spend more time in distress because you'll be running around trying to prevent it all day. And that's not going to work. That's not a long-term solution.
Absolutely. And that tolerating your child's distress is another parenting behavior.
Exactly.
A behavior that a lot of parents have to learn. Because again, your instincts, we talked about this initially, is to want to protect your child with all of your being, right? You don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to struggle. You want them to be okay. But like you're saying, I mean, we learn a lot from failure. We learn a lot from making mistakes. And there's, opportunities to learn new skills in that experience.
Yeah. And I think that for parents, and again, always the best outcome comes from giving parents information as early as possible. And I use this metaphor with parents a lot, particularly with young kids. And I talk about life experience being like climbing a tightrope that's going up higher and higher as kids get older. And when kids are really, really young, if they fall off this little tightrope, they're an inch off the ground. They fall, it's uncomfortable. It might hurt a little bit. It might embarrass them a little bit. But as soon as they have that experience of a natural consequence failure, it makes them mindful of what happens when you do something you shouldn't. If you never let your child have those initial early life falls and failure moments, then they're actually going to feel invincible as they get older. And we see them as they climb this ladder. As the stakes get higher, they might engage in more impulsive, dangerous behavior or things they can't imagine it going wrong because we've artificially prevented it or escaped and avoided those high stakes situations. And for me, that's far more scary than the fact that a kid's going to fall a lot when they're little. Watch them learn how to walk. They've got no problem falling 73 times an hour because they want that freedom and autonomy. But when it comes to other parts of our lives, we don't let them slip and fall a little. And sometimes that's on us as parents. And we got to say, like, how do I cope with this? What do I need to do for me and my parenting behavior, my self-regulation to say this is okay and to tolerate it and to teach so that they can get better at it. But no one achieves anything great without experiencing failure. I genuinely believe that.
That's absolutely true. And I love that analogy with the tightrope because you can see that if they never, experience those failures early on and they experience it when they're older, the fall is so much more, significant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. For parents who feel overwhelmed by their child's challenges, behaviors, are there first steps or guidance you would recommend for them to kind of regain a sense of control and calm, probably more importantly than control in their household?
I think the metaphor of thinking of parents If you've been on a plane, you always hear about these rules, which are if those oxygen masks drop from above and you're sitting with a child or someone who needs help, put your mask on first. And I always think about that as my first piece of parenting advice. An exhausted parent without oxygen is a useless parent. Their kid is going to be in great trouble if that parent isn't doing self-care, isn't getting good support for themselves, isn't learning how to self-regulate. And those things aren't an outcome. Those things are a daily process. I'm doing things every day to make sure that I care for myself. So I think that for parents, the first thing I want to say to them is that when I teach you how to parent your child best, I have to remind you how to take care of yourself in that interaction. And by doing that, you will teach your child that they are valuable, that they should care for themselves, and that they should be with people who help them care for themselves. And I think that's sort of the overarching message for all of this. All the other strategies are out there and are freely available, but it is about how you deliver them, how they genuinely fit you as a family, as an individual. And I think that until you have that foundation of self-care, self-regulation, and I'm valuable, and I don't deserve abuse, or I can't function if I don't care for me, and I can't care for you if I don't care for me, is I think the most important parenting behavior lesson I ever give. And I have to remind people of it every couple of weeks, because parents, by definition, we're taught in our culture here in this country that parents are selfless. Parents give all for their children's success. And I think that's a trap. I think that sets us up for something that is unrealistic. And in actuality, we're teaching our children about being successful, loving, and a part of the world in a way that is productive and helps others and self. And that doesn't happen by laying yourself down as a sacrifice. Maybe different if you're in a high danger situation. I have no doubt that so many of us would put ourselves in harm's way for our child, but that's not what we're talking about here. Sacrificing ourselves by not sleeping for days and not eating properly and not taking care of ourselves is very different than in the danger situation. It's far from the same.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. We pour into our kids all the time. And I often say, like you're saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. If your cup has a hole in it and you're pouring everything you've got and you're getting drained from both ends, our parents' mental health is talking about how porous is your cup. And if you're not able to sustain that amount of self-care, wellness, and health, then it's going to be very hard to distribute any of what you have to anyone else.
Absolutely. Dr. Kahn, thank you so much for this conversation. I know that our listeners will want to learn more about, the work that you do, understanding their child's behavior, how to positively influence it, how to better take care of themselves so that they can support their loved ones. Where can our listeners go to connect with you, your work at Understood, and your podcast?
Sure. Well, the easiest way to get to us is to go to understood.org, or even easier than that is the letter u.org, which we also have connection to. And you will see on our site connections to my podcast, to our chatbot, which is amazing for question and answer. And again, there is no cost to our services, but there's just so many resources there. So go to us at understood.org and, come explore the resources and see what we have to offer. And thank you, Dr. Wilson, so much for having me here.
Thank you for being here. And I will be sure to put links to all of that information, all those great resources in the show notes. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Be sure to check out the show notes. There you will get information about Dr. Kahn's podcast and all the fabulous resources at Understood. I hope that you will also sign up for our newsletter at childnexus.com. There you will get insights, strategies, and event updates designed to support kids and teens just like yours. Valuable information to nurture your child's potential and well-being. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.